Thank you for joining me for this episode of God Talk. And in this episode of God Talk, we want to explore a little bit about when is the world going to come to an end? Now, as I mentioned that, the obvious answer to that, if you've ever listened to me talk on the subject, is like the Bible's clear, no one knows. But what's interesting is like, I don't know, if you go back 20 plus years ago, everyone always wanted Bible studies on the book of Revelation and go back even further. Whenever you're going through the radio and there's a preacher preaching on something, it seems like oftentimes it was like end times. When is the world going to come to an end? And and I'm not saying that you don't hear that talked about anymore at church, but I feel like it's talked about a lot less. I feel like as America's become far less Christian, it's just not on the top of people's minds anymore. But we know from scripture that there's going to be certain signs that will mark the end times, and we're living in a day and age in which a lot of those signs are going on. But what's interesting, like as we've moved out of the time in which people seem to be thinking about the end of the world a lot, really one of the last signs that needs to take place, and I think we're on the beginning end of it, at least, is that it says in the final days, people will be like in the days of Noah. They're going to be eating and drinking and just kind of carrying on and doing life, and they're not going to be thinking about the end of the world. And I do believe that we're very much in that period of time, than a period of time in which people are hyper alert and insensitive to the end of the world. And so not only do we have the signs of like wars, rumors of wars, increase of wickedness, the spread of the gospel across the world, like all of those things have been going on and are kind of reaching a height of their own fulfillment since they were written, the words 2,000 years ago. But the one about people not expecting it, that is, at least during my lifetime, I think more unique. I can't speak for 100, 150 years ago, but I feel like that's just been kind of a central thought of Christianity across the ages is the imminent return of Christ, because we're told to be prepared. But culturally speaking, once again, because there aren't nearly as many Christians in America today, it's not thought about as much. And honestly, if you think about a lot of the larger, maybe more non-denominational churches, they've become much more feel-good churches, and there's not really a lot of talk about the return of Christ. So potentially we're getting into a time of fulfillment that maybe is unique to the generation in which we're currently living. Now, throw on top of that everything that's going on with Israel, and it becomes even more interesting. You have a year ago, I think a year ago this past October, when the people came across the border and and attacked Israel and put Israel in what's been this October a 1 year long war in which they've gone through all of Gaza and destroyed tunnels, tried to root out and kill all the terrorists. And as we're reaching the 1 year mark on that, Israel is increasingly turning their attention to Lebanon and Hezbollah, and potentially we're on the cusp of seeing a second back-to-back war from Israel on that. And then the real question is, and the fear I think is, will this spark a larger war in which Iran and other countries might get involved, and it becomes more of a regional conflict, or maybe the source for a worldwide conflict? And the question is that rooted in biblical prophecy? And I think the argument can be made that, yeah, it's rooted in biblical prophecy. And on top of not only these wars that we see going on in Israel, that's further complicated by the 3 years or whatever war we've had between Russia and Ukraine. There's always the possibility of China with Taiwan. Throw on top of that just the the political chaos in the United States right now, not only a divided country, but we've had a couple of assassination attempts on former President Trump, just the craziness of Biden being removed off of the ticket and Kamala Harris running for the Democrats, who in many ways sounds much more like a traditional Republican, at least on her foreign policy, as many Republicans are sounding more like what Democrats were 50 years ago. I mean, the whole thing is really kind of on its head. And so do we see evidences of what's going on in the world today with the scripture? And I think an argument can be made that there's this giant battle that's going to take place during the end times, and that battle is known as the Battle of Armageddon. We don't hear about that as much now as what we heard about that 30 years ago, but there's been movies made called Armageddon. It's kind of synonymous with the end of life and the end of civilization. What's interesting is the Bible's not as clear on that as what sometimes we give it credit, for being. It's mentioned really just one time in the book of Revelation, and it's not even directly mentioned that there's going to be a battle. But if you look at the inferences of it, it does seem like it's going to be a battle. Revelation 16:14 says that demonic spirits are going to perform signs and then go out to gather the kings of the earth for battle. So these kings of the earth, led by these demonic spirits, are going to go gather together for battle. And then in verse 16, it says, they gather the kings together to a place called Armageddon. So now there doesn't that is the reference. It's translated Armageddon, but it literally from the Hebrew would be the mountain of Megiddo. So that's on this figurative mount. It's a real mount, but it doesn't have to be literal. And that's the other thing, that when we deal with Revelation, we have to be careful what we take literally. Some people are like, no, it says this and it literally must mean that. No, we actually don't have kings anymore. So as we interpret these passages that demonic spirits are performing signs and they're gathering the kings of the earth for battle. No, we don't have kings. A few countries do, but most countries more like a president type office, but they didn't have that back in the days in which Revelation was written. There were no presidents, so everything were kings. So even when you read Revelation, you have to understand it in the context in which it was written and then translate it based upon where we're at today. And you ought to be able to make an argument that you can substitute the word kings for presidents. And so we're told that they're gathered for battle, and then at this place, literally like the Mount of Megiddo, which then gets translated from the Greek into the English Armageddon. The assumption is if they were being gathered in verse 14 for battle, and they're gathered to this place, that this giant battle takes place. And as you get further along in Revelation, you read about this battle that takes place, and it's the ultimate battle of good and evil. Jesus defeated evil on the cross, but there's going to be a final battle of good and evil on this earth. And maybe like revolving around Israel. Doesn't have to, but if you're reading it literally, that this is going to take place around the mountain of Megiddo, which it really isn't a mountain. It's just kind of a high area, a plateaued high area. And if you read that literally, then yeah, this is going to involve Israel. And what's interesting though is, like, say 50 years ago, you always kind of thought about America as being on the side of good, like the forces of evil are going to be battled against the forces of good. And 50 years ago, we lived in the assumption, America would be on the good side. I don't think that's true anymore. I mean, I don't know. We're big supporters of Israel, so maybe America's still on the good side, but we can certainly see the influence of the demonic spirits on the kings and the leaders in our own country as America has become increasingly secular. So I don't know that we can necessarily say that, but it's interesting times because you have this this 1-year war that Israel's just getting out of, and they're moving quickly, it seems, into another. And especially if this does go to a regional conflict or a worldwide conflict, I mean, to fill this, put that together with, we're in a day and age in which people don't really seem to be thinking about the end of the world a lot. People are eating and drinking, just kind of going through life, living life, and so forth. So there's a lot of different things that are kind of coming into play that are prophecy. And so I really, I don't get worked up about this. There's no way that we're going to change prophecy. We know that the world's going to become increasingly wicked at the end times, and it is. I can fight that as hard as I want, but you can't fight prophecy. It's just going to happen, right? And if you read this literally, that there's literally going to be this final battle of good and evil, and if you read it literally, that it's going to be somewhere around, this hill of Megiddo, the Mount of Megiddo, but it's more like a plateaued hill. Like, if you're reading all this stuff literally, like, I guess you'd have reason to be a little concerned. And I do know a few people who potentially are, but personally, I'm not. Why? Because, well, ultimately, God's in charge, and this earth is God's, and you and I are God's children, and we were taught to pray in the Lord's Prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done. So we pray, we should desire the will of God to be done. And we see God's will in prophecy. And maybe there is going to be, World War III. Maybe there's going to be this giant battle of good and evil. Maybe we will be called into service to fight in this battle. Maybe our kids will, or our grandkids. And listen, I mean, I've got, a son that's fighting age. I've got a grandkid that's going to be born in late December. I guess I could focus on, the health and the well-being of my son, not wanting him to be drafted, or, if we're still further out in this, like, no one wants to think of their grandkid to have to fight in a war and die in battle. But honestly, like, I don't allow my mind to go there, because I do pray, and I do mean that I do want God's kingdom to come, and I do want his will to be done. And we see that will in prophecy, that basically all the prophecy of what the end of the world is going to look like is being met in our own day and age. And even if World War III breaks out, I'm not going to, like, I'm going to still, like, whatever that looks like, I'm going to try to live as a faithful, obedient child of God. But I'm just not going to freak out about that any more than I've freaked out about, COVID, or, getting bad news from my doctor, about my own health, or what have you. Like God is in control. But it's interesting, possibly, that we're living in a very unique time in human history in which potentially, maybe in our lifetime, we'll see the end of the world. I'm not saying that because no one knows the day or the hour. I don't know. I'm just saying, in a sense, I don't care. But even though I don't care, it doesn't mean that, like, we shouldn't be informed about it. Like, we need to know. In fact, if you take it like a football game, right? Like, we record a football game, and we're not able to watch it live, and sometimes someone spoils the secret, right? Someone tells us, like, the Cowboys won. Well, that spoils it to an extent, but you're able to watch it unfold. You can go back and watch the game with a whole different perspective, a whole different piece than what you would otherwise have. Like, if you don't know who's going to win, like, you're going to be freaking out about every little thing that happens along the way. Like, as you're watching the football game, and oh my goodness, they're blowing the lead, or oh my goodness, like, I can't believe they're playing this bad. A second turnover, a third turnover, this isn't going to turn out well. If you know how the story is going to end, you don't have to freak out about that. So on one hand, I don't care about what happens and when it happens. But on the other side, like, we need to be talking about it, because we need to know that ultimately good wins and God wins. God already has won in Jesus Christ, but God is going to be winning when all things come to an end. And we can look forward to spending eternity with God in heaven. Now, one last thing that I kind of want to say on this topic is as we're going through this time of all the chaos in the world today, and contemplating whether or not all prophecies are on the verge of being fulfilled, and that we might see the end of the world in our own lifetime, which we're told to be prepared for. Every generation should, and we need to be prepared for it as well. But I want to mention an Irish saint. I every few years I talk about this guy. I heard a story like, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, and it was interesting. It caught my attention. It's about an Irish priest and some prophecies that he had back in like the late thousands. Like, the guy's name's Malachi. He's an Irish saint, and he lived from 1094 to 1148. So, like, I mean, this is old stuff. Okay, we're talking almost 1,000 years ago that this guy lived. Now, what's interesting about this guy, and I'm not big into people that prophesy about the end of the world, because once again, no one's supposed to know the day or the hour. I mean, when God gives revelation to John, or to Daniel, or Jesus talks about the end of the world, we pay attention to that because God's given us some information so that ultimately we're prepared and we know who wins the game, right? So I am not saying that I fully believe what I'm about to tell you. I'm just saying it's interesting. And so for those of you who might be interested in it, I'm going to tell you about him, and you can research it yourself. But so this Irish saint Malachi, he wrote these prophecies, and the prophecies were basically how many popes that there would be from his time until the end of the world. Now, mind you, like he wrote this 1,000 years ago, so like you might expect he might think that there would be 50 or what have you, or maybe 20, but that's not what he predicted. He actually predicted like 112 additional popes. Kind of a random number. Like he claimed to have received this vision, and there was going to be 112 more popes before the end of the world. And there's this series of 112 kind of cryptic, a little bit vague, some more than other, hidden Latin phrases in which, he predicts then each one of these phrases represent a future pope. And his predictions are that there would be one more after Pope Benedict. And Pope Benedict, of course, is the one that ended up retiring. I think one of the few, maybe one or two that ever retired, because normally you die by being a pope. You remain a pope until you die, and then they pick a new pope. Well, so after Pope Benedict, there's just supposed to be one more pope, and so we are in with our current pope, the last pope, according to 1,000-year-old prophecy from Saint Malachi. So he would say that Saint Francis, or Pope Francis, would be the last of the popes. He says at the end of the 112 popes, additional popes from the time that he lived, that there's going to be the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, and there would reign Peter the Roman. And he says Peter the Roman would be feeding his flock amidst many tribulations, after which then the seven-hilled city, that is Rome, would be destroyed, and the dreadful judge would appear before the people. And then he says, the end. That is his final prophecy, his final prediction. So the question is Pope Francis, does he fit this final pope, which he calls the reign of Peter the Roman? And what's interesting on Malachi's like prophecies of these different popes, some of them are like man, he makes Nostradamus look like a rookie, right? Like some of these predictions are very exact, and some maybe a little bit more vague than others. I would say this is one of the more vague ones. So Pope Francis, he's the final pope's supposed to be Peter, and Pope Francis's name isn't Peter, nor did he didn't take on the name of Peter as the pope. So Pope Francis, he was born Jorge. I'm not even going to try to pronounce his legal name that he was born with. So his legal name that he was born with wasn't Peter, and he didn't take the name Peter when he was declared to be pope. So it doesn't appear that this really fits what Malachi was saying. But one of the theories to kind of tie Francis to the predictions of Malachi is that St. Francis's father's name was Pietro or Peter. So his name's not Peter, but his father's literal name was Peter. So the question is, is this a fit? I honestly, like, that doesn't really work real well for me, but with a stretch, maybe you could say it is a reference to the current pope. So in 1139, the Archbishop Malachi, he went to Rome from Ireland to give an account of his affairs. And while he was there, he claimed to receive a strange vision in which then, he had the vision of all these future popes, 112 from his, in addition from when he was alive and when he had the vision. And once again, some of these are a little bit more close in their predictions. What's interesting is, so he made these predictions, in year 1139, but honestly, like these predictions were lost until they were found in the Roman archives all the way back in 1590. So it's not like it's not like they were just found, 50 years ago. Like it was found in 1590. I mean, so we've had these for a long time and we've seen them kind of unfold. What's interesting is, as for the prophecy of the 111th Pope, Pope Benedict, the one that we had before Francis, he kind of nails that one. So what Malachi says of Pope Benedict is, he says, Gloria Olivae, which means the glory of the olive. And the order of St. Benedict is known as the Olivetans. So, I mean, he nails that one. It's spot on. Pope John Paul II, what he said is, and I'm not even going to read the Latin on it, but basically the prophecy that is assigned to that pope was the eclipse of the sun. And Pope John Paul II was born on May 18th of 1920 during a solar eclipse. So like I'm saying, like, he's nailed some of these that can't be in a coincidental way. So it's very interesting. I don't think the Pope Francis one is a stretch with Peter the Roman, but there's some others of these that just can't be coincidental. So I don't know what to make of it, but I wanted to kind of throw that out there as we're living in these strange times. I think one of the last prophecies that people won't be really thinking much about the end of the world. I think we've moved into that with secularism. People aren't really thinking about that a lot. We've got some interesting wars going on in this world, and specifically with Israel and the threat of that going into a larger context. And then you got this stuff from Saint Malachi. So, maybe you look it up, you kind of see what he's about. I'm not saying I believe it. I'm not saying I don't believe it. I just find it interesting. But I wanted to talk on this topic because I think a lot of us, our attention is being grabbed by what's going on in Israel today. And the question is it reflective of the prophecy that we see in Scripture? And the answer is it may very well be. And in the end, it doesn't matter, because you're not going to stop prophecy. God's kingdom come, God's will be done. But it's good to know what's happening and who wins. Then we don't have to freak out along the way as we go. Thank you for joining me for this episode of God Talk, and I hope you have a wonderful week. God bless.